now Saturday, January 14th, and I'm just going to dive right in. Last video, the introduction was way too long, so it took me 5 minutes before I got into the actual material. Let me make sure this, okay. So we're going to ask whether there ever was a fall in the sense that most of us are familiar with. As you know, mainstream Christianity teaches more or less that that the first man violated an external or revealed law given by God in the Garden of Eden regarding a prohibition on partaking of a particular tree, namely the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He violated that law, and it created a disturbance in the fabric of reality, which caused God to respond with measures to bring back, to restore balance in the system, so to speak. And of course, this ultimately required a mediator to do for us what we could not do for ourselves. The other model, well, I'll just go ahead and address that one first. So there are two broad models of a fall. The model I'll address in a little more detail right now is not the one I just mentioned. It's one that you will sometimes hear in a Neoplatonic context, to invoke a church father. It's also connected with the name of Origen, who believed that primordial souls fell from I guess you could call it the celestial realm. Neoplatonists might call it the archetypal realm. And when they fell, they descended through the different, I guess, planes of existence. And as they descended, they became cooled. And as they cooled, they became more dense. And they contracted gross materiality or physicality. To put it in more explicitly mystical or hesychastic terms, to use an Eastern Orthodox term, a Greek term, the nous somehow became detached from God, and its desire was no longer chiefly for God. Its desire shifted to lower things, to the realm of materiality. And so the nous being the eye of the soul, more or less, or the seat of the soul, the center of the soul. It shifted its gaze, so to speak, from God to the lower things, right? And as a result, man fell into concupiscence, to use a Roman Catholic term, or fell into desire or sinful passions. The reason that view must be rejected is that if there were an original union and communion with God in the archetypal realm in eternity, because that's where the archetypes reside or exist, the archetypes reside eternally in God. If that union, the only way one could fall from that state is if the union were imperfect. if the union were imperfect, then there's something defective in God. If the union were perfect, then the fall, as it is proposed or presented by the originistic perspective, could not have taken place to begin with. So then that leaves us with the second model, which I guess you could call, broadly speaking, the forensic model, which brought about a need for justification, the need for an outside intermediary to mediate between humankind and the Father. And we've discussed this in some detail in the past, so I'm not going to really spend a lot of time with it. We've already talked about how that model really renders mysticism superfluous. And so you really have to ask the Eastern Orthodox side, and I address them more particularly because that's what I came out of. You have to address specifically how it is then that mysticism takes such a central place. How does it take central stage in Orthodoxy if a mediator, an outside mediator is required to restore this breach that was effected by Adam's action in partaking of the forbidden tree or the forbidden fruit? So this creates a breach that becomes the foundation for, or lays the groundwork for, the belief in eternal conscious punishment, where there could be no sort of ontological connection from all eternity between God and his creation. Because if there were, he wouldn't be able to damn expressions of himself, or archetypal expressions of himself, instantiations of the divine, right? He wouldn't be able to do that. So what you have to posit then are two ontologically independent, totally separate realities. God on the one side, creation on the other. Which, as we already covered in the last video, that's impossible, because now you have two realms out of sync with each other, outside of each other, existing independently, which means that neither realm can be fully divine or truly infinite, because that means that there would be a space within which the other did not exist. So that leaves the third option, which is the option I take. Now, I'm not an expert by any means in Neoplatonism or Sanatana Dharma. I'm a mere student. But from what I've been exposed to in my limited exposure and my limited experience so far, I have detected, and correct me if I'm wrong, anybody who comes across this video, I have seen, my impression is that within Neoplatonism, there are two somewhat different approaches. Now, I know this is the case in Sanatana Dharma. There are two different schools of thought. Some people take a view that's very originistic in character, where you basically have souls who somehow fell. There was this inexplicable primordial disturbance that caused the souls to fall, and they cooled and they became dense and they contracted physicality, and then they became entangled in Maya or illusion, which is more or less equivalent with the physical world. The other view is that there was no fall whatsoever. So what God did is he created numerous worlds, numerous universes, possibly even multiverses. Within this reality, you have you have higher and lower realms or dimensions or planes of existence. Each planet, habitable planet or inhabited planet, has 7. This is kind of how it's generally framed. Is that it has 7 higher realms or heavens, and then 7 lower realms, sometimes referred to as the hellish realms, which are temporal. So the suffering one may undergo there in the afterlife between lives is purely temporary. The heavens themselves are not the ultimate. None of them represent ultimate union with God. They represent states wherein the person has achieved a higher level of consciousness, perhaps, but they have not quite attained to a perfect union with the divine. In the middle, you have, our physical realm, and so my school of thought, which is Kashmiri Shaivism. You'll find this in Trika Shaivism or Kashmiri Shaivism or the Shakta schools of Tantra, is you have like Russian nesting dolls, to use an analogy. You have 36 different principles. Tattva means principle, or realms, or different degrees or gradations of subtlety or materiality, so to speak, in this sort of unbroken chain of degrees of physicality and subtlety. So you'll see this in a mantra, or not a mantra, in a yantra, a Hindu yantra or mandala, that will often depict like a labyrinthine sort of graphic or geometric pattern. So I hate to speak in terms of ascent and descent and transcendence, because it's not that any realm, however low it is on the so-called ladder, is somehow evil. Rather, there are just different levels, different gradations. So that the further out you go on the mandala, the more dense or physical or material you go, and then the further in you go towards the center, which is depicted by that dot in the very center, the bindu, represents the most subtle or spiritual realm or state. So when God, to cut to the chase here, when God manifested his body, so he has an infinite, eternal body, space itself is not nothing, it's something, right? And it's infinite. When God began to manifest forms that by forms, I'm talking about the things that we can see or detect or measure: planets, stars, trees, etc., animals, humans, plant life. All those things are the eternal body of God being made manifest. And when he did that, God was voluntarily lowering himself or constricting himself or limiting himself in time, quote unquote, in this temporal experience, temporal realm of experience. And this, to make it easier for people who are listening to understand, because I know a lot of people who are listening are coming from a Christian background, think of this as kenosis. So in the Christian concept of things, when the Son was sent by the Father to take on flesh, that's an example of kenosis, God limiting or lowering himself, right? So when Jesus, a good example of this is when Jesus said that no one knows the day or hour of my return but the Father only. They would say that this is an example of that kenotic principle at work in the incarnation in the life of Jesus Christ. In the Dharmic understanding, in this tantric school of Kashmiri Shaivism that I identify with, the manifestation of God's body, this creation itself, is God taking on that limitation. So that's why I speak in terms of souls being contracted, limited, individuated aspects of the eternal consciousness of God. So while there is a direct connection ontologically between individuals and God, while I would say that I am divine and you are divine, I am God and you are God, there's still a fundamental distinction between the source of my being, or the source of my being, or the origin of my being, and my individuated existence. There's still a distinction. So there's an identity, but there's also a distinction. There's that balance. So was there a fall? No, there was simply God voluntarily limiting himself in this manifested mode of his bodily existence. Now, Maya then, in this understanding, illusion, the Sanskrit term for illusion, is not that the physical creation is unreal or only real in appearance. It is objectively real. However, as I mentioned briefly in the last video, it is not. It's mental, because it's an extension of divine consciousness. Now, before I move on, I have to clarify something, because that will sound to a lot of people like solipsism, where reality is only what exists in your head. That's not what I'm espousing. What I'm saying is that there is an objective outer world, outer environment that we all collectively experience. Okay, so it's not just in my head or just in your head. But that reality is in nature conscious, or spirit. Matter, as we think of it, or as we humans in the past few centuries have traditionally thought of matter, doesn't really exist. It doesn't have independent, standalone existence. It is just consciousness in a contracted form. And so the Maya, the illusion that we experience when we are born, is that a world in which everything is sort of divided and broken up and separated. We think of beings as being separate beings. The other, this is why the other often becomes seen as the enemy, as a hostile. This is why we live egoically, according to the ego. We follow our own desires, our own lustful passions, or anything that involves, doing harm illegitimately to another, or living in a way that embodies a dualistic perspective on reality. Things appear that way in this world. That is the illusion, okay? That reality is dual. But it's a mere appearance. So it's not that the physical world is merely an appearance. The physical world exists. But it's our false perception that the world is dual in nature that is the illusion. So that's the Maya we suffer from, or ignorance we suffer from. So when we do quote-unquote evil things or sinful things, the sin is not in violating an external command that comes from an outward deity who gets angry when we fail to live up to that standard, or who is somehow disturbed within himself, and then requires some sort of redress of the situation, like in the Christian context where the Father sends the Son to perform certain things so that the balance is reestablished. There's nothing like that in the perspective or frame of reference that I'm coming from now. So in order to be self-realized, in order to truly know who and what you are already divine. So you're not trying to attain something. You're not making an effort to become what you are not. What you're doing is you're over time, as you grow in your consciousness and your understanding, as you grow in understanding, the reality of who you are and what you are becomes more manifest to you. And that is essentially what it is to be self-realized, or to experience your true nature. Your true nature is bliss. To be in blissful communion and union with God and with the self, or the Atman, which is infinite and eternal. And so we would say that the things that we think of as constituting the self, the essence of the self, really isn't the essence of the self. Things like our feelings, our thoughts, our emotions, our desires, those are conditions. That's part of our conditioned existence. Now that brings up other questions that I can't address in this video, but I will address them separately. So that's where I stand on the issue. So it's not that anything goes, right? It's not that we can't be accused of saying that you can do whatever you like, engage in it, take on any form of behavior, engage in any sort of activity. No, not at all, because that would be to live a dualistic existence, which is not in alignment with reality. Okay, when you live in a manner that is in alignment with reality, that is the only means to experience this eternal bliss that is union and communion with God, and self-understanding and self-realization. Yep, that's it for this one, and I'll see you guys back here soon. All right, thanks a lot. Have a great weekend.